Welcome to the Deep Dive. So glad you could join us today. We are getting into something that is honestly pretty wild.
Yeah, it's a massive, massive topic today.
It really is. So picture this, right? HBO just built some of the most expensive, intricately detailed, practical, physical sets in the history of television.
Right.
And it's for a show entirely centered around the awe and wonder of discovering magic.
Which is the whole point of the franchise, yeah.
Exactly. And then, after all that, they decided to film the entire thing in the dark.
It's a profound visual contradiction right out of the gate. I mean, you have this massive capital expenditure on these tangible environments, right?
Yeah.
Only to just bury them in a lighting scheme that feels like, I don't know, a bleak midwinter crime drama.
Like a Scandi noir thriller or something, which honestly perfectly sets the stage for what we are doing today.
Absolutely.
We are taking a really deep dive into the absolute labyrinth surrounding the new HBO Harry Potter television.
And we're grounding this entire exploration in a really granular, incredibly thorough breakdown from the YouTube channel Pop Culture Crisis.
Right. They recently dropped this massive analysis, and they look at everything from the strange aesthetic choices in the new trailer to the intense casting backlash.
Down to the incredibly thorny ethics of modern media consumption.
It's just a lot. But before we get into all those weeds, we need to talk about why you, the listener, should actually care about this.
Yeah, because it's an essential piece of analysis. Frankly, even if you haven't thought about Hogwarts in a decade.
Right.
Or even if you've never picked up one of the books, you really need to pay attention to this production.
Exactly, because this single television show is acting as a perfect crystalline microcosm for the current state of Hollywood.
It touches on the life cycle of intellectual property, the volatile nature of modern internet culture, the staggering logistical realities of long-term television.
And the rapidly shifting, sometimes really aggressive dynamics of legacy fandom.
Yeah, it is a real-time case study in the mechanics of modern entertainment.
But, and this is very important, before we really get going, we do need to establish the parameters for this deep dive.
Right, the rules of engagement.
Because the source material we're unpacking today, it touches on some highly charged, intensely debated political and social topics.
It absolutely does.
Specifically, the controversies surrounding J.K. Rowling, the ongoing cultural debates over transgender rights, and the incredibly heated reactions to race-conscious cast.
And our purpose here today is strictly analytical. I want to make that very clear. We are acting impartially to report and unpack the arguments and the structural observations that were presented in the source material.
Right. We are not here to endorse either side of these cultural divides.
Exactly. Nor are we, injecting our own political stances into the mix. We are serving purely as your guides to help you understand the complex landscape of this debate.
And exactly why it is impacting a multi-billion-dollar production on a structural level. We are dissecting the mechanics of the storm, right? Not arguing about which way the wind.
I like that. That's a great way.
Thanks. So, okay, let's unpack. Pop Culture Crisis. They start their analysis by looking at the immediate visceral reaction to the very first trailer HBO.
Yeah, the teaser.
And you would think, with the pent-up anticipation for a return to this universe, the trailer would be,
I think so, yeah.
But the critique really zeroes in on the visual aesthetics. They describe the footage as drab, dark, blue, gray.
I think they literally use the phrase gray slop.
Yes, gray slop to describe the color grading.
Which is, it's evocative. And looking at the footage, it's structurally accurate. I mean, The analysis points out that the only real breaks in this incredibly muted, desaturated color palette are some slight orange color grading in the Great Hall.
Yeah, the candles and stuff.
Yeah. And then a very overt, almost unnatural orange tint, specifically isolated on the character of Ollivander's face.
Which was weird.
It was. Everything else is completely swallowed in shadows.
But the theory Pop Culture Crisis puts forward for, why it looks like this, that's what really caught my attention.
Oh, the CGI crutch theory.
Yeah. They argue that these extremely dark aesthetics are actually a modern Hollywood crutch. It's a deliberate, functional technique used across the industry right now to just hide bad CGI.
Right. Which brings us back to that initial contradiction you mentioned earlier. HBO reportedly built massive practical sets for this show.
Yeah, they spent a fortune on them.
Exactly. So if you have these gorgeous, tangible environments, the crutch theory doesn't entirely hold up. Why apply a technique designed to mask green screen scene if you aren't relying entirely on green screens?
That's a million-dollar question.
And the analysis actually highlights this fan-edited version of the trailer that circulated online to prove this point.
Oh, I saw that.
Yeah, a fan just went into their editing software and brightened the footage. They color corrected it to a more natural, balanced exposure.
And it looks so much better.
It looks significantly more clear and whimsical. It revealed that there is a vibrant, magical aesthetic hiding underneath that grating if the artistic choices prioritize joy over gloom.
Right. But I have to push back a little on the idea that this is just a technical mistake or a CI cover-up.
Okay, what do you...
Well, it feels much more insidious than like a poorly calibrated monitor in the editing bay. It feels like they are deliberately applying a prestige sad filter.
A sad filter.
Yeah,
That's a good term for it.
Right. And I have to wonder, is this just a fundamental misunderstanding of the source material's tone on the part of the showrunners? Or is this a highly calculated, demographic-driven move to make magic feel gritty so that older adult audience validated in watching a show about a love bomb?
It's almost certainly the latter, honest. And it really speaks to how the visual language of television has evolved over the last 20 years.
How so?
Well, think about the institutional DNA of HBO. Their biggest historical culture-defining successes, The Sopranos, The Wire, Game of Thrones, Succession, The Last of Us, they all share a certain visual weight.
Yeah, they're heavy, visually and thematically.
Right. So there is this entrenched institutional belief at that network that desaturation equals prestige.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense.
By applying this gray slop aesthetic, the executives are likely trying to signal to the market, hey, this isn't the whimsical Chris Columbus movie you remember from 2001. This is serious high-stakes television.
But as that Brighton fan trailer proved, that artistic choice fundamentally strips the identity out of the intellectual property. It's supposed to be magical.
It is. Yet, despite the visual gloom, the metrics of the hype are staggering.
Oh, the numbers are insane.
Pop Culture Crisis notes that the trailer accumulated 277 million views in just its first 48 hours.
Which is, wait, that makes it the most watched trailer in the entire...
Exactly. It's a colossal number. And it proves the underlying magnetism of the brand is still incredibly potent. But, this is a big but, the analysis provides a necessary reality check regarding scale.
Right, the Spider-Man.
Yeah. They compare that 277 million to the trailer for the video game Spider-Man, Brand New Day, which pulled in 718 million views in just 24 hours.
Which completely reframes the achievement, honestly.
Completely. So while 277 million is a massive internal record for HBO, in the broader landscape of modern mega pop culture, it shows that the audience is highly concentrated rather than universally dominant.
But those 277 million views don't just stroke HBO's ego, though. They trap...
What do you mean by that?
Well, because once you prove the demand is that massive and you secure that level of upfront investment, you are financially locked into delivering a product that logistically might actually be impossible to film over the long term.
Oh, the production time. Yeah, Pop Culture Crisis digs into this, and it is a logistical nightmare.
It really is. I mean, we are so accustomed to the modern streaming model now. You get a season a year, maybe every 18 months if there's a heavy VFX pipeline.
Right, but the analysis highlights comments from HBO executive Casey Bloys, indicating this series will likely operate on a biannual release schedule.
A new season every 2 years.
Yeah.
Which, if they are adapting all 7 books, 1 book per season, releasing every 2 years, by the time the final season covering the Deathly Hallows actually airs, we are looking at the year 2040.
2040. It sounds absurd to project a television schedule 2 decades into the future.
Yeah, it sounds like sci-fi.
It does. But the mechanics behind that delay are rigid. It comes down to strict child labor laws.
Right, because the core cast members are all young children.
Exactly. And by law, they are severely limited in how long they can actually be on a hot set working under light. The analysis estimates they might only be allowed to film for about 4 hours a day.
4 hours? That is nothing on a film set.
It's a blip. The rest of their mandated time has to be dedicated to on-set schooling, tutoring, and the extensive wardrobe, makeup, and safety choreography required for a fantasy production.
Think about the burn rate of capital on a set like that. You have a multi-million-dollar crew, massive soundstage, expensive equipment just sitting idle. Or you're forcing the director to shoot B-roll around stand-ins for the majority of the working day.
It's wildly inefficient. But the children aging is only half the problem.
Oh, right. The adults.
Yeah. Pop Culture Crisis brings up this highly pragmatic, slightly morbid hypothetical regarding the older cast members, called the Lithgow dilemma.
Referencing the rumors of John Lithgow being in talks for a role in the production.
Exactly. The math on the adult cast is just as unforgiving as the labor laws for the kid. If the show runs until 2040, an older actor cast today, someone in their late 60s or 70s, playing a Hogwarts professor.
Like Dumbledore or McGonagall.
Right. They could literally be in their mid-90s by the time the series finale.
Which immediately brings up the historical precedent of Richard Harris.
Oh, yeah.
He played Dumbledore in the first 2 films and passed away at age 72, incredibly early in the franchise, which forced a massive, highly publicized recast.
And that was on a much tighter, heavily compressed feature film schedule. It highlights a grim reality of modern legacy television production. When you greenlight a 15-year narrative arc, you are essentially gambling hundreds of millions of dollars on human biology holding.
So, if human aging and mortality are the primary adversaries of this production schedule, how do you mathematically underwrite that? Like, are we looking at a paradigm where AI stand-ins and comprehensive digital likeness rights are no longer science fiction, but mandatory boilerplate contractual clauses?
That is such a good question.
Do these actors have to sign away their digital faces in perpetuity just to guarantee the studio can physically render a character?
It raises an incredibly important point about the current evolution of Hollywood contracts, especially post-strike. Given the timeline and the capital involved, it is highly probable that the studio is requiring unprecedented contingency plans.
You'd have to, right?
Absolutely. You cannot secure a completion bond. The insurance required to actually shoot a project of this scale. If your entire narrative hinges on a 75-year-old actor's health remaining perfect for 15 years without an ironclad backup plan.
Wild to think about.
That likely means aggressive digital scanning of the actors on day one and contracts that allow the studio to digitally manipulate or reconstruct performances if an actor is incapacitated.
But, securing the physical continuity of the actors is just the baseline logistics. The cultural logistics of keeping a massive cast unified, PR-trained, and willing to work under a highly controversial creator for 50
That requires an entirely different kind of risk management.
Yeah, it's a powder keg. And Pop Culture Crisis leans heavily into an argument recently published by The Verge, which essentially declares that there is no ethical consumption of this new.
Right. The foundation of that argument comes down to the direct pipeline between media consumption, capital generation, and real-world advocacy.
Because J.K. Rowling has a reported net worth of roughly $1.2 billion.
Yeah, and crucially, she retains primary rights to the property, meaning she directly profits from the licensing and viewership of the show.
So The Verge argues that because she actively uses her capital and her massive public platform to fund and support ads that oppose certain transgender, anyone who watches, reviews, or supports the show is inadvertently contributing to her wealth.
And by extension, the political causes she champions.
Right. And what we're seeing now is how this external cultural pressure cooker is already causing structural fractures within the production itself and the broader alumni network.
The cast fracture. Yeah, Pop Culture Crisis details several.
Like Andrew Garfield, he apparently just watched the original films for the first time, and he gave an interview where he praises the cinematic universe, but then intentionally goes out of his way to condemn Rowling.
Yeah, referring to her exclusively as she who will remain nameless.
Which is a whole thing we'll get into. But then you also have Nick Frost publicly and preemptively distancing himself from her.
Yeah. And you have Papa Ezzy, who is cast as Snape, actively signing open letters supporting trans.
And there were even rumors that John Lithgow nearly walked away from the production entirely over Rowling's day-to-day involvement.
What's fascinating here is what this friction reveals about intellectual property power dynamics in the modern era, because J.K. Rowling represents an absolute anomaly in the current entertainment ecosystem.
How so?
She operates under a bygone era of Hollywood content. She is perhaps the last true mega successful author to hold majority, ironclad, non-negotiable rights to her own.
Let's break down the mechanics of that. Why does that matter so much to HBO's PR department?
It matters because it completely paralyzes. In modern Hollywood, think the Marvel era, or the post-Netflix streaming boom. If a creator writes a hit novel and a studio adapts it, the creator almost always signs away their primary IP rights immediately in exchange for a payout and a passive created by credit.
So the studio owns the universe outright.
Exactly. If that creator suddenly becomes a PR liability, the studio executes a morality clause, releases a carefully worded press statement, and keeps printing money with the IP.
But HBO cannot do that here.
They have zero leverage over Rowling. She holds the cards, she is actively executive producing, and the studio cannot separate the art from the artist because the artist legally owns the art, the studio's adaptation rights, and the final say.
Wow. I want to dig into that Andrew Garfield quote, though, because I think it exposes a flaw in how modern cots operate.
The she who will remain nameless.
Yeah. By pointedly calling her that, he's literally using her own universe's mythology, the exact structural phrasing used to describe Voldemort as a weapon. And Pop Culture Crisis points out the irony here. Doesn't that inadvertently validate her absolute cultural dominance?
It does.
If naming her directly or explicitly choosing not to name her using her own fictional vernacular, both serve as a flex of her relevance. I mean, is an organized boycott even mathematically possible against an IP that is this foundational to the global monoculture?
It's a brilliant observation on the nature of anti-fandom. The analysis explicitly states that in the current attention economy, whether you name her or refuse to name her, she's still winning.
Because you're still playing in her sandbox.
Exactly. The cultural framework she constructed is so ubiquitous that it has become the very language her detractors are forced to use to criticize her. It demonstrates that this franchise functions more like a modern mythology than a standard television show. And because of that inescapable gravity, the friction between the progressive ideals held by the cast and the creator's highly publicized stances creates an impossible PR tightrope.
Every interview, every press junket for the next 15 years is going to be a minefield for these actors.
Oh, absolutely.
And you can argue that no one on this call sheet is walking a more dangerous tightrope right now than the actor stepping into the most morally ambiguous, heavily scrutinized role in the entire franchise.
You're talking about Papa Esidu taking on Severus Snape.
Yes. The casting of Papa Esidu serves as the ultimate crucible for all of these intercepting cultural pop crises.
It really does. Because Esidu is a black actor taking on a role that was originally written as white and famously canonized in the public imagination by Alan Rickman.
The analysis breaks down a highly revealing interview Esidu did Times of London, where he addressed the immediate visceral backlash casting.
Yeah, he revealed the sheer volume of racist abuse he's receiving online, which escalated to literal targeted death threats.
He quoted messages telling him to quit or I'll murder you.
It's horrific.
Yeah.
But the mechanics of his response to that vitriol are incredibly telling about his pragmatism. He told the Times that he actively refuses to report these threats to the police.
Which surprised me, but his reasoning is really interesting.
His stated reasoning is that he doesn't believe jailing a 17-year-old kid for 2 weeks does anything to dismantle the underlying societal infrastructure of race.
Instead, he views the hate as a utility. He's channeling it into making his family proud and, more importantly, into providing representation.
Right. He wants a young black kid to be able to turn on HBO, see him operating at the highest levels of magic at Hogwarts, and see themselves reflected in that universe.
Which is a highly pragmatic, long-term approach to But pop culture crisis, they strip away the sentimentality entirely and approach this from a stark economic angle regarding the realities of the act.
They do. They actively defend Esidu against factions on the internet, demanding he step down from the role as a form of protest against Rowling.
And the analysis is remarkably blunt here. They highlight the brutal statistical reality of trying to survive as a working actor.
Yeah, they referenced the recent Disney Plus series Wonder Man to illustrate the systemic failure rate of the industry. They note that 99.999% of actors will never make a sustainable, lifelong living from their craft.
It's a gig economy masquerading as clamor. So to demand that an actor voluntarily walk away from a guaranteed 10-year contract that secures generational wealth, all for the sake of internet posturing, the analysis correctly identifies that as financial insanity.
Exactly. They argue he has essentially secured a lottery ticket level role, and forfeiting it would be a dereliction of his own career.
Absolutely.
However, the analysis pivots the blame entirely onto the structural decisions of the producers.
How so?
Well, by making a race-conscious casting choice in a highly volatile cultural climate, and doing so within a narrative that is intrinsically obsessed with themes of bloodline, purity, and prejudice. The HBO executives knowingly placed Esidu directly in the crosshairs of a deeply toxic fandom.
Which leads us to the most complex systemic argument in the entire breakdown. It's what the source calls the narrative trap.
The narrative trap. This is crucial.
Because casting a black actor as Snape isn't just about managing external PR or dealing with race troll. Pop culture crisis argues it fundamentally breaks internal structural tech.
Yes, this is where we have to look closely at the semiotics of film and narrative framing. The analysis asks us to examine the specific, infamous backstory between Severus Snape and James Potter.
Right. In the original text, there is a pivotal structural flashback where James Potter and the Marauders ruthlessly bully a young...
They humiliate him. And specifically, they use a spell to hang him upside down in the air, exposing him in front of the entire school.
It's Snape's worst memory. It's the critical narrative hinge where Harry and the reader realize that James Potter wasn't just a flawless hero, but actually kind of a cruel jerk.
Exactly. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the cultural and sociological context of that scene changes drastically when you alter the racial dynamic.
Right. In the 1999 publication of the book, James Potter is a privileged white kid bullying an underprivileged white kid.
It's cruel, But as the analysis notes, a schoolyard bully is an established literary trope. It represents a character flaw that a person can eventually outgrow, apologize for, and be redeemed from.
But if you cast a black actor as Snape, and he is being physically dominated, humiliated, and hung upside down by a group of wealthy white students, the visual imagery fundamentally shifts.
It ceases to be schoolyard bullying. The visual language immediately evokes profound historical racial trauma.
It's heavy.
It is. The analysis points out that audiences and critics are already equating the visual prospect of a black Snape being hung in the air by white students to a lynching.
It's like updating the operating system on a 20-year-old computer. You change one line of code to make the interface look modern, and suddenly 3 foundational core programs crash entirely because they were completely reliant on that old code to function.
That's a great analogy because the implications for the writer's room here are catastrophic. As the analysis bluntly puts it, you don't come back from being a racist bully.
Precise. If a modern viewing audience interprets James Potter's action not just as arrogant teenage bullying, but as racially motivated, James Potter instantly transcends from being a flawed teenager who matures hero into an irredeemable racist.
And there is zero narrative runway for a redemption arc for a racist bully in modern media targeted at young audiences.
None. And if James Potter is irredeemable, it destroys the emotional logic of Harry's reverence.
Furthermore, it completely obliterates the emotional weight of Snape's ultimate sacrifice. Snape's entire arc hinges on him fighting and ultimately dying out of his unrequited love for Lily Potter, a white woman. The analysis argues that layering the incredibly fraught racial dynamics of a black man spending his life in misery only to die for the cause of the white woman whose white husband racially abused him. It creates an ideological knot that the writers simply cannot untangle.
Can the showrunners even write these scenes cleanly anymore? Or does every single directorial choice, camera angle, lighting, line delivery in that flashback generate a fresh controversy from every possible political spectrum?
The analysis concludes those scenes cannot be executed cleanly. Every choice will be a trap.
Wow.
And this narrative trap is compounded by a deep structural confusion at HBO about who this show is actually designed for.
Oh, let's talk about that audience mismatch. Because the demographic targeting feels entirely schizophrenic.
It really does. Pop Culture Crisis analyzes the aesthetic choices in the teaser, specifically the hairstyling and wardrobe of the child actor, and they make a sharp observation.
They note that the styling looks heavily trend-driven, clearly targeted at Gen Alpha, the demographic currently an element.
Right. But the primary audience, the people holding the HBO Max subscriptions and driving the social media metric, are millennials looking for nostalgia.
It creates profound visual Furthermore, the analysis points out that the show does not appear to visually anchor itself in the 1990s, which is when the original text explicitly takes place.
So you have a production actively trying to monetize millennial nostalgia, dressed up in Gen Alpha aesthetic, ignoring its own canonical timeline, while simultaneously trying to navigate the hyper-scrutinize 2020s culture.
It sounds like a development hell that somehow made it to screen. Given all of these impossible traps, the IP baggage, the narrative unraveling, the demographic confusion, how does HBO actually intend to win back the audience?
How do you reclaim the magic when the well feels this thoroughly poisoned?
Exactly.
Well, according to the analysis, the production's primary survival strategy involves actively going off script.
They are purposefully writing in narrative side missions that do not exist anywhere in the original text.
Which, on its face, sounds like a spectacularly bad idea.
Oh, yeah. When you are dealing with a legacy fandom that is already highly suspicious of your motives, adding non-canon filler is usually a death.
Pop Culture Crisis mentions a specific rumored scene they are shooting that shows Hermione Granger receiving her Hogwarts letter at her home in the Muggle world, interacting with her parents.
A moment that happens entirely off books.
Yes, and the host of The Breakdown admits their initial reaction to this was overwhelmingly negative. Why invent new material when you have over 1 million words of beloved, meticulously plotted source material to adapt?
But then they offer a highly pragmatic realization regarding the psychology of the audience.
Separating this new show as much as possible from the beloved Chris Columbus and David Yates movies might be the only viable way to survive.
It's an avoidance strategy, because if you just execute a one-to-one, shot-for-shot recreation of the book, the audience will spend every single second of the broadcast comparing the new child actor to Daniel Radcliffe, Emma Watson, and Rupert Grint.
And nostalgia is undefeated. The new kids will lose that comparison every.
Exactly. So by adding these new scenes, by expanding the world in ways the movies never had the runtime to do, they create a narrative buffer. They offer something genuinely additive to justify the reboot's existence.
And Pop Culture Crisis offers a very specific tactical roadmap for how the show could earn back pure fandom currents, particularly among the hardcore book readers who felt alienated by the films.
Oh, I loved this part of the analysis. It involves systematically fixing what many consider to be the original film franchise's greatest struggle, the cinematic sidelining of Ron.
They completely mocked Ron in the movies.
They really did. The analysis passionately details how the screenwriters for the films systematically stripped away every single one of Ron's tactical, heroic, and grounding moments and just handed them to Hermione to make her look more capable.
Reducing Ron to purely comedic relief.
Yeah. The breakdown provides the specific examples that have frustrated book purists for 20 years. They argue the HBO series needs to immediately restore Ron.
In the first season, they need to highlight that Ron is the tactical savant who navigates the giant chessboard.
They need to show him maintaining his composure and remembering the magical theory to defeat the devil's snare plant, rather than screaming in panic while Hermione saves.
And crucially, the analysis points to a massive character-defining moment in the third book, The Prisoner of Azkaban.
Right. In the text, Ron is nursing a broken leg, but when Sirius Black, who they believe is a deranged mass murderer, corners them, Ron literally stands up on his broken leg, puts himself physically between Harry and Sirius, and says, "If you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too."
It is the defining moment of his fierce loyalty.
But the movie just gave that exact line and that physical action to Hermione.
So the working theory is that if the HBO series painstakingly restores these specific character dynamics, if they lean into a deeply text-accurate Ron Weasley, and if they significantly increase the focus on the mechanics of the Quidditch matches, which the analysis feels the movie severely truncated,
they might generate enough goodwill to win back the court.
it's like a restaurant changing management after a massive, highly publicized health code scandal.
Yeah. If you bring back the original beloved recipe that everyone has missed for a decade, will the patrons eventually just ignore the ongoing drama?
Will they overlook the ethical boycotts and the culture war noise just to see Ron Weasley finally play a competent...
It is a massive financial gamble. But the analysis does note one significant glimmer of hope: pure unapologetic.
Oh, the Draco Malfoy casting.
Yeah. They point out that the most universally praised casting choice revealed so far seems to be the young actor playing Draco.
The Breakdown was actually thrilled about that casting. They said the kid genuinely looks like an elitist dickhead who would cruelly mock a poorer student for having old sneakers or hand-me-down robe.
And while that sounds like a harsh critique of a child actor's face, in the context of this civic narrative, it is the highest possible praise.
It proves that when the casting directors nail the core, authentic, unvarnished essence of the character exactly as written in the text, it cuts through the noise and resonates perfectly with the audience.
It suggests that strict fidelity to the text might be their only effective shield against the cultural backlash.
So as we pull back and look at the massive blueprint we've unpacked today, we have traced a really wild, complex trajectory.
We really have. We started with the staggering, record-breaking metrics of a trailer that critics are simultaneously missing as dreary perceived rate.
We navigated the unbelievable logistical and actuarial nightmares of underwriting a 15-year television shoot reliant on strict child labor laws and aging actors.
We waded through the intensely heated ethical battlegrounds of IP ownership and the paralyzing nature of J.K. Rowling's leg tracks.
And finally, we look at the semiotics of modern casting choice and how altering one variable like the race of a character completely unravel the moral framework and structural integrity of a legacy narrative.
It is a phenomenal, almost unprecedented amount of cultural and financial pressure to place on a single television production.
It really is.
And I want to remind you, the listener, why we spent an hour unpacking the mechanics of all this today. Like, why does this matter to you, even if you never intend to watch a single frame of this new?
It matters because this show is the absolute bleeding edge blueprint.
Whenever you tune into a massive franchise reboot now, whether it's Star Wars, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter, you are no longer just watching a story.
You are watching a high-wire act of corporate finance, modern cultural politics, IP law, and artistic compromise, all playing out in real time on your screen.
Understanding the invisible mechanics behind the curtain makes you a more literate, more engaged, and more critical consumer of modern media.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on, building on everything pop culture crisis laid out for us today.
Let's hear it.
Traditionally, the entertainment industry gauges the success of a mega franchise through universal cultural buying. We measure it in global merchandising sales, the physical expansion of theme parks, and the sheer number of kids wearing the costumes on Halloween.
Right. Historically, these properties thrive on joy and shared.
But if a modern intellectual property finds itself in a position where it is relying on a decade of sustained goodwill that arguably no longer exists,
if it instead finds itself surviving purely on the metrics of hate watching crushing culture war engagement and the endless cyclical oxygen of internet content.
Does the franchise actually survive, or does it eventually consume its own magic, feeding on the friction until there is absolutely nothing left to sell?
That is a fascinating and structurally terrifying question to leave off on. Are they building a new house, or are they just monetizing the arguments over the haunted foundations?
Exactly.
We'd love for you to think about that. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the trailer, and keep challenging the media.